Welcome to the Melbourne International Film Festival 2019 program, Schools program bringing languages and learning to life as immersive international cinema for students. We are excited to offer this free teacher webinar as part of a valued collaboration between MIFF and MLTAV. The focus of this webinar is the charming animated Japanese film Okko. The film is scheduled to screen at the Sofitel Melbourne on Collins Auditorium on Thursday 8th of August 11 a.m. and Wednesday 14th of August at 1:30 p.m. Full details of the MIFF 2019 Schools program, films, locations, session times, as well as information on how to secure a school booking can be found on the MIFF website under the MIFF Schools link. MLTAV member schools can take advantage of reduced ticket prices for school bookings, as well as one teacher per 10 students attends for free. But I'd suggest getting in quickly because seats to these films do fill quickly. Our presenters for this webinar are Josh Nelson, film specialist, who will share some of the technical and artistic aspects, and Sean Pratt, our language and culture specialist, who will focus on language and intercultural insights. This webinar is a valuable resource to introduce teachers to the film and provide suggestions and give examples as to how you can work with students in the classroom, both in preparation for seeing the film and afterwards, including how aspects of the film can be linked to the Victorian curriculum. I'll hand over to Josh, who'll then hand over to Sean. This is the live version of the webinar, but we will be recording it as an archive version, which will be available on the MIFF website. So without further ado, over to you, Josh.
Thank you, Kerry. Welcome to you and to Sean and to our live participants and to those following this via the archived version. So as you just heard from Kerry, the first part of this webinar is going to focus on some of the filmic elements of Okko's In and suggesting some classroom strategies for introducing that filmic language and terminology into the classroom in combination with obviously the focus on language and the cultural aspects. And I think this is an important element of approaching cinema, which ties into the broader curriculum within English, within EAL, literature, and also media studies as well. So this is, I guess, an important skill strategy in terms of linking it to other elements of the VCE curriculum. Before I launch into the filmic focus more broadly and then more specifically in terms of the film, perhaps just to give you kind of a brief synopsis of Okko's In without too many spoilers. So Okko's In focuses on a young girl named Oriko, or Okko as she's often referred. And at the beginning of the film, she's involved in a car accident where she's the sole survivor. Both her parents are killed, and then she moves in with her grandma, who runs a spa, an onsen in a sort of a rural part of Japan. And Okko assumes, or gradually assumes, the role of junior innkeeper within the spa. And she's assisted along the way by a small group of ghosts who also inhabit the town. So that's a basic synopsis without too many spoilers, and I'll largely avoid those as we go along. Okay, so getting back to that focus for this first part of the webinar presentation and this emphasis on film techniques. So the kinds of things that I think students really should be looking for in addition to those language and cultural aspects are the filmic building blocks, the kind of production elements, even within the context of an animation film like this. So the kinds of things that I think would be useful to return to in a post-screening context discussion, things like the use of cinematography, whether it's a close-up or wide-angle shot, how the camera moves in and around the actors or the characters in this case. Mise-en-scène is obviously a really key term within film analysis, and that incorporates various elements of the production, from props, the use of costumes, the use of lighting, the composition of particular frames within the film, the position of actors within that frame or characters, the use of music, the use of sound. Obviously dialogue is important in this kind of language context, the use of voiceover if it's used, narrative building blocks, narrative structure, story elements, editing, and also importantly visual motifs and symbolism. And I think for students at a lower level who may not be familiar with this kind of terminology or approaching films in this way, rather than trying to dump all this on them before the screening, it might actually be useful to assign different production elements to different students or groups of students so they can focus in on one particular aspect in addition to those language elements while they're watching. Because what you really want to foster for these trips and within the MIFF Schools program is an active viewing experience where they're not just going in to be entertained, they're actually critically thinking about how a director creates meaning, how they construct character, themes, and so on within that filmic context using these particular techniques. So moving on to a sort of more specific focus to Okko's in, the kinds of themes, key themes that I think this film deals with, and I'll touch on these in varying degrees, and I'm sure Sean will follow up on some of these as well. Obviously, grief and trauma or mourning. I mean, the fact that the narrative is really the hook for the narrative is the death of Okko's parents and how she deals with that. This is a prominent theme within the film. And I guess that links to broader themes of acceptance, forgiveness, for example. The film also has a strong focus on families and intergenerational conflict. And again, I think in a Japanese context, it's interesting to look at how that theme is played out through Japanese cinema, even going back to Ozu and Tokyo Story, even earlier than that. But that's such a key text, I think, that defines so much of Japanese cinema. Themes of the past, animals and the natural world. Again, these are sort of common recurring themes, particularly within Japanese animation. And also, I think, and importantly, the film really foregrounds Japanese traditions and customs. So again, this is quite a fruitful text in terms of using it to explore broader issues within Japanese society and Japanese language. So I think it's often useful before you focus in on those key production elements in terms of class discussion to start in a broader context. And I think genre is a really useful one in this sense, because the film is, I guess, loosely a coming-of-age narrative about this young girl, Okko. So again, trying to prompt students to think about similar types of films, or what are the story elements that define this film within that coming-of-age genre that they may have experienced before or seen examples of before. So the kind of, I guess, the elements that define this within that genre. This is obviously a transitional or a defining moment of Okko's adolescence. We see her mature over the course of the film. Her very sort of youthful innocence that we see at the beginning is very much not the same Okko we see at the end of the film, in a positive way. Also, the use of supernatural elements within the context of this film, I think, provide a strong link to Japanese cultural heritage. You know, I'll touch on some of these as we go along. But other key elements within this film, in the specific element of genre, the presence of magic and supernatural elements within the quote-unquote real world, the idea of a community out of balance. You know, this idea that comes up within the film of the spa town is under threat. What's its future going to be, and its longevity in a broader cultural or social context. We have families in conflict into varying degrees. There's a focus mainly on adolescent characters around Okko's age, and also this foregrounding of the natural world. And I think just some examples that came to mind while watching this film. Ponyo, the Hayao Miyazaki film from 2008, it's his sort of loose adaptation of The Little Mermaid. Again, that focus on this sort of the supernatural elements mixed in with the real world, and the focus on adolescent characters that we see in that film. A Letter to Momo, again, another Japanese animation, which focuses on the death of a parent as a catalyst for a mother and a daughter to move to a small rural sort of fishing village town. I think it is in that context. And again, there's a presence of ghosts or supernatural creatures which help the young child to deal with that. So this is not an isolated example within Japanese cinema. And even a film that was part of the MIFF Schools program last year, Lu Over the Wall. Again, these sort of similar themes are recurring. So again, if students have seen some of these films before, it's a really good starting point as a sort of point of similarity and contrast. The other, I guess, broader context to look at this film is through the lens of animation. And again, this is an element you could look at some cultural differences. Japan has a long sort of standing tradition of this two-dimensional animation. I mentioned Hayao Miyazaki before, with Studio Ghibli, Princess Mononoke being a kind of key example of that, but even more adult sort of targeted animation, such as Ghost in the Shell, and the kinds of themes or issues that come up within Japanese animation. How do they differ from, say, Hollywood animation? Not just stylistically, where you see in the examples I've given there, the focus really is nowadays on CGI characters, CGI backgrounds, three-dimensional, hero-driven narratives often. So what are those key points of similarity and difference, not only in terms of visual style, but themes? And again, I guess higher level students will have probably more experience with these different types of animation. But again, teasing out, I think, those points of contrast is a really useful way of situating this film within the broader animation traditions. Okay, so structurally, I think moving into the narrative of Okko's in more specifically, the film has an episodic, or fairly episodic structure or narrative. So basically, once Okko has moved in with Oba-chan and the grandma, and she starts working within the inn or the onsen, we have this group of guests, and one after another, they come in and they reflect various aspects, or they reflect back to Okko what she's going through, and often in terms of grief and mourning. And it's interesting that the film has this largely episodic structure, because the origins of Okko's in, I was talking to Sean before we went live, that this began as a series of books that I think then was adapted to a series of manga, which then became a television series, and then now it's in its sort of filmic incantation. So again, thinking or prompting the students to consider what each of these guests, what their significance or their importance is within the narrative to Okko. What does she learn from them? How does she come of age with each subsequent guest? And I think it's interesting because she definitely changes from one to the next. They're really catalysts for her awareness. The other thing in terms of structure is the use of editing. And this film has quite some sequences which are quite sophisticated in terms of its editing and also its use of flashbacks. And again, this is one of these areas where you can link the filmic elements of the use of flashbacks to the themes of the past, themes of remembrance, and so on, which are sort of dispersed throughout the film. And in one example here on the bottom left, we have the grandma is prompted to recall her childhood relationship to Urubo, who happens to be one of the ghosts that Okko meets within the inn. And it begins as a black and white photographic image, and then it slowly cross-dissolves into this color image, which becomes the memory. So again, we have a very specific type of transition and use of editing within that context. And then on the right-hand side, on the lower right, we have a very different one. And that's a really key sequence within the film where Okko is taken on a kind of a shopping trip with one of the guests. And we get her in the car, presumably for one of the first times since the accident. And this use of cross-cutting, where she starts to get almost traumatic flashbacks to the accident, to the incident. And it's really intricate in terms of the way in which the cross-cutting occurs in this. But again, very different to the earlier style and the memory flashback. So trying to get, I guess, prompt students to consider how different types of editing reflect different types of, say, memory or grief or trauma in this case. Because in that sequence, it's very much the past is being brought back into the present, not just for Okko, but to the audience through the positioning of the hands, where we have, the mother goes to pass I think it's a cup of water or tea to Okko, and of course then we cut back to her hand, where it's almost like the ghost of her mother has disappeared, and now we see her clutching these dolls or these trinkets. Again, these are all certain elements that, say, if you'd aligned or assigned a particular group to focus on editing, that I think would prompt some interesting class discussion. So more broadly speaking, in terms of cinematography, really basic language for younger students, and these are really the building blocks of cinematography. So the close-up, why does the filmmaker use a close-up? To create and emphasize an identification with character. And this is really key, particularly at moments of heightened emotion, such as there we get with Okko really emphasizing this sort of really this cathartic emotional moment that comes later on in the film, or the use of wide angles, often to emphasize setting, but in this case, we also see Okko in the moment just after the accident, lying atop the car from almost this sort of spirit's God's eye angle from above. Again, there's a number of ways you could interpret that moment, but the contrast between wide angles and close-ups is important in terms of their meaning within the film. And again, in various other aspects, how does the angle of the camera inflect our understanding of character? And here we have a perfect example of the low angle shot and Okko's, I guess, pseudo rival or frenemy within the film, Matsuki. And we have the low angle shot emphasizing her power position, emphasizing her status within the frame, and the reverse with the high angle shot looking down at Okko when she first arrives at her grandmother's inn. Again, the lack of power, emphasizing her sort of passive position within the narrative. I think the other element in terms of prompting students to consider how do we identify with characters is the point of view shot, where the camera adopts Okko's perspective. And we have that in a flashback with her climbing up from beneath the blankets into bed with her parents, and also looking down where she's just put on a kimono and is struggling to walk in it. And again, sort of almost a comical gesture, but again, putting us in her position, really emphasizing our connection to her character. And in terms of the filmic aspects that I flagged at the beginning, mise-en-scène really is a key element within any film analysis. So the film begins and ends at this festival within the rural spa town. My kanji is terrible, so I won't try and translate the signage there. But again, these are sort of elements within the background at the beginning and end of the film, which provide fruit for analysis and discussion in terms of what is going on, what the signs represent, what are they saying about the culture and the festivities. But even on a more specific character level, and in terms of contrast, how do filmmakers construct character through purely visual means? And here we have an interesting contrast just in terms of the mise-en-scène of two different rooms. So we have Okko's room, very basic tatami mat room. She's by herself. She's basically starting her life again with her grandma. I think you could potentially read this in terms of the traditional design of the room. Maybe there's a class context there as well, given the lack of possessions, and this is very sort of Spartan in some regards. And the contrast with Matsuki, that rival, and this is almost this shot of Matsuki's house, very much a different style in terms of that non-traditional, perhaps even more like a Western manner. This shot to me recalls similar compositions in, say, Citizen Kane, where we have a man surrounded by his wealth, but he's sitting in the dark with a tiny bit of light, emphasizing his isolation. And really that is what I think the filmmakers are getting at with Matsuki. So if you could prompt students to analyze those images or those contrasts, to say, what does this image tell us about this character? But through those visual means, through the mise-en-scène, I think that's an important stage within that film analysis. Okay, I'll push through some of these key themes and motifs, and then I'll hand over to Sean to look at some of these in more detail with a focus on those language and cultural aspects. So I mentioned one of the obvious themes within this film is death and grief, and this is not just about Okko and the way in which she deals with death and grief, but how other characters deal with it, and even how Japanese culture treats these ideas of death. And of course we have the photo, the food, that sort of the shrine within the house, and that's repeated throughout the narrative. And again, I think it's interesting to prompt students to how do different characters deal with loss and grief within the film, because we see a variety of emotional responses to it in terms of behavior as well. The theme of family is obviously prominent. The fact that the film begins with the separation of a family, but also I think perhaps more interesting is the hierarchies and the responsibilities, the assumptions that are associated with families within this Japanese context. And this is a perfect prompt to look at more cultural aspects, and is the structures of the family structures within Japanese society or Japanese culture different to how they are in, say, Australia or other parts of the world? And again, looking at things like hierarchy, the focus on education, the image there on the lower right, and the kind of the bowing and respect for this other family because of an assumed slight that they may have caused offence to one of their guests. Again, these are all interesting prompts that come through this theme. The motif of photographs, again, obviously, this motif links itself to broader themes within the film. The focus on memory, the focus on past, the focus on loss, family, acceptance, and so on. And this recurs in various guises. One of the key interesting elements within this theme or this motif is the contrast between generations, because we have grandma's photo book, mostly in black and white images, and then we have the sort of digital medium and digital photographs for not just Okko, but one of the other guests, reflecting on a mother who's passed away. And I think there's an interesting conversation or discussion point within this in terms of the generational difference in terms of their relationship to photographs. And is there a difference, or is it simply a different format of delivery? Maybe I'm getting off track here. One thing I did think, and this might be digressing too far while watching this, is the stereotype of the Japanese tourist, the photo-obsessed Japanese tourist that we saw in so much Western culture, particularly in, say, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Has this stereotype disappeared now with the advent of digital technology and phone technology, and everyone from every culture obsessively taking photographs of everything? I think maybe students will have had no experience with this stereotype before. Again, maybe I'm getting off track, but I think there's a potential conversation started within that. Culture and traditions, obviously, I know Sean's going to touch on some of this, some of these aspects, but certainly the festival and the traditions at the beginning, in terms of, say, the taiko drumming, the use of masks. In the lower right, we have a demon bell which summons a sort of an impish spirit named Suzuki, which again plays a role within the narrative. So what is the emphasis or value or importance that this film places on these traditions? What role do they place or have in terms of Okko's acceptance, or the way in which she deals or heals with grief and trauma? I think the film certainly places differing values on these traditions, and at the same time questions them. There's one key moment which stuck out for me, where a young boy sort of bites back at his dad and says, "I hate this you must work hard all the time mentality," or mindset, is the translation there in the lower right image. And again, this sort of the sense of the intergenerational conflict that comes from this inherited ethos from their parents, and almost rejecting that. So again, does the film question these values? Where does it sort of sit in terms of its ideologies, I guess, or its values? The motif of nature is obviously key, and it really defines Okko's change throughout the narrative. When she first arrives at the inn, she's terrified by everything that comes from the natural world, be it lizards, spiders, moths. And gradually over the course of the narrative, her relationship to the natural world changes. But the film also places different emphasis on nature in terms of customs and traditions, in terms of the significance of the natural world, in terms of healing, or the natural world having a sort of a supernatural quality to it, which it does, or as it does in, say, the films of Hayao Miyazaki. I had to throw this in clothing, again, a kind of motif which comes to the fore, again, representing a contrast between the traditional, that we have the kimono, and the commercial, the more contemporary. The sequence where Okko goes on this shopping trip with one of the guests is quite fascinating. It's almost, maybe this is drawing a too long a bow, but suggesting that her entry, or her coming of age, the key part of her coming of age is her entry into the world of consumerism. I thought that was an interesting element, which also has quite a specific gender context, which again might be useful in a class context to talk about the gendered relationship to clothing and Japanese culture, or comparing it to Australian culture. I know Sean's going to talk about food, but it's obviously a key motif in terms of the context of the inn, in terms of Okko's character, and also her coming of age. Again, a lot of these motifs and themes are interlinked. I think this is quite an accomplished film in that regard. And lastly, where the film comes sort of full circle. So it begins in this festival context with Okko and her parents watching these traditional dances, and we return there at the end of the film. So the idea of bookending the film, presumably a year apart, with this festival is, I think, a really useful narrative structure to talk about, well, what has changed in that year? How is Okko different? How is the setting different? Has the culture learned anything? Have the other characters come full circle or altered in any way? And again, think about how the film represents these ideas of acceptance and healing at the end. And the two lower images, one of the stage foregrounded by the cherry blossoms, and then we have the dancers on the stage, without giving too much away, flanked by these two prominent ghosts within the film. So again, it's a perfect ending as a sort of a starting point or a launching off point for the character's journey and their arcs within the narrative. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Sean to look at those language and cultural aspects in more detail, but I'm happy to come back and discuss any of those elements.
Okay, thank you very much, Josh. I like the way you tied that in as possibly a 1 year long narrative for the film. Okay, now the MLTAV uses the MISE framework outlined below. I'll just show you that. Outlined below to guide learning with artistic works. You can read it for yourself, but it's notice, interpret, create, and evaluate. This framework is underpinned by the intercultural approach, which connects the engagement with linguistic and cultural elements to the student's own identity and experience to enhance their intercultural understandings and, in the long view, social cohesion. Okay, so I'll just be guiding you through this framework as we look at the film. Now, obviously, as a Japanese animated feature film, that brings in so many different levels of culture. But the film, the great thing about this film is that it can really be viewed by all secondary year levels, and I would say going younger than that, probably upper level primary school age students as well. Now, obviously, depending on the age of the students, the teacher may look to initiate different levels of discussion on any of the following aspects that I bring up. But as people look at the film, they may see other things that are not discussed here, and certainly this film is full of little snippets of Japanese culture all the way through. So prior to the film, teachers may like to ask students to consider any of the following from both current knowledge and whilst they watch the film. So just generally as an approach to Japanese anime, what do they expect to see in a Japanese animated film, and how might this compare to some of the other international animated features that Josh had up on the screen before, things such as the Lego Movie, perhaps, and some of the other CG features that have appeared recently. The other little bit of comparison that you could do before this, because a lot of the students I know will be familiar with Studio Ghibli films, or they may not, but certainly if they are, I think the director, or at least the key animator that is involved in this film, worked at Studio Ghibli. And you sort of, if you look at a comparison between something like Spirited Away, Ponyo, those kind of, or Totoro, you see that the development of the young female throughout the film, which has been a feature of Studio Ghibli for in many of the films. Now, when you're looking at Japanese anime, the students may give you a few silly little responses. They may just be thinking of things like Pokemon or Dragon Ball, but certainly it'll get them thinking about the films. Now, in terms of looking at a Japanese anime, there's a difference between the way Okko is portrayed in the film in comparison to her grandmother. Okko has the classic wide-eyed, big-eyed young girl features that we see in a lot of shoujo manga, and whilst the grandmother has more realistic features. I suppose you could say a realistic face within the context of animation. Now, the film, as Josh said, was adapted from a series of children's books that have also appeared in a manga series. One thing the students might like to think about as they watch the film, if can they see where each episode seems to start and end? Where does each little adventure or each little story end, and how does it add to the narrative as they go through? Okay. Now, just staying with notice. Now, the detail and the colour in the film are particularly well done. It's a visually spectacular film, and there's a lot of detail seen in the traditional inn, making it a great visual text, which, as many of people listening will know, we're really looking at visual text in our approach to the new study design with the VCE. Now, in terms of the setting of the film, students may consider things such as how a Japanese room is different to Western rooms. We get a really, really good look at the ryokan, the Japanese inn, tatami rooms, how the place is put together, usually only by wood, and how it's going to differ. This kind of inn, how it's going to differ to something like a normal hotel. One thing about the ryokans and generally onsen culture, especially a ryokan with an onsen there's a lot of onsen villages up in the mountains in Japan, and it has brought with it its own leisure activity and leisure industry, where families may go away for the weekend to an onsen, or couples may go away for a little bit of space and stay in a ryokan. Very, very different type of leisure activity to what we see in Australia. Now, just asking the questions too, back to the anime in general. Do Japanese people have supernatural beliefs? What anime have students seen that features supernatural beliefs? And of course, probably all of them do. I can't really think. Onyo, Totoro, so many ghosts and animal spirits appear throughout the course of the history of anime that you'll certainly get a few bites there. So just going through that, you may ask the students, what anime have students seen that features supernatural beliefs, and what are the supernatural beliefs? Certainly there's a lot there. Okay, now just looking at with the ryokan and the film in general, the village is obviously quite old, and there are certainly a lot of aspects of Japanese traditional life in the film. What aspects of traditional life are depicted? Well, you can start with the festival at the beginning, and the dancing. That's one aspect of it. Just the way that the grandmother is always in a kimono. I don't think we see her at all in Western clothes throughout the whole film. Things like going away to the mountains to hop in to a hot spring in general, certainly such a typical Japanese thing to do. And of course, and one of my favourite parts of the film, when the two ghosts are chasing each other over the koinobori, the carp streamers. If the students have done any work on Japanese traditional events and festivals and culture, they'll all know that that's part of Children's Day. All right. Now, again, what do we learn about what might be described as onsen culture? Teachers might want to brief their students about what an onsen is, and the different types of the different way that the Japanese approach bathing. You might get a few surprised reactions to that, but certainly it's something to look at, and a key difference really in between Australia and Japan. Certainly it's something that I always encourage my students to go and experience when they go over to the country. Now, just one final thing on this slide. Okko and her grandmother, they're innkeepers. They're part of the service industry. what cultural values are revealed in their role, in Okko's role as junior innkeeper, and certainly in her grandmother's approach. There was a previous slide where we saw them bowing to one of their customers and apologising, and certainly grandmother takes the opinion that the customer is always right, or at least the customer always needs to be satisfied. And that is certainly part of the lesson that Okko learns throughout her journey in the film. Now, so prior to attending the film, we're looking at how names are used when referring to people. Now, Okko was Okko from most people, but Oriko when she went to school. And I think that is the only time that we hear her surname used in the film. When her first name's used, when are positions used, worth thinking of. When is summer used as a suffix to a lot of the clients' names in the inn? Certainly that's a talking point. Okay, now after attending the film, how can the students relate to the events that have happened in the film? Well, probably not so much to bathing culture, but they might sort of like to look at the relationship between the two girls in the film. Matsuki, was she a rival? Was she a bully? Are they becoming friends at the end? I think a lot of adolescents would relate to difficult relationships as they develop in their school years. Now, again, prior to attending the film, we think of Japanese culture and how people always address each other according to their status and their level of familiarity. Certainly, Okko's grandmother is always using polite form. And the relationship between the customer and the client is very, very clear. Students might want to reflect on how that customer-client relationship is apparent in their life through any of the part-time jobs that they may do, or may be about to do. Certainly, always trying to relate the film back to what is common to the students, and they may find that kind of customer-client relationship something quite familiar. Now, there's a little bit of English in the film, certainly with some of the quotes made by Matsuki. I thought they were very, very interesting. But one of the most common words we used by Okko was pinku furiri. Pink furiri was taken as an insult by Matsuki, not because it's necessarily semantically rude, but because it was a direct description of what she was wearing. Now, thinking of what other English words were used in the film, and encourage the students to look out for them, because they're certainly there. There was the quote by Steve Jobs, and actually there were two or three other quotes. The other thing that I found particularly interesting with the film was the grandmother's form of communication, where she was quiet when they were sitting in the table discussing what Okko was going to do, whether she was going to be part of the company or the inn, and whether she was going to start helping as the junior innkeeper. After attending the film, the students, we can ask the students to reflect on what they noticed in relation to who, when, where the different forms were used. Was there any English words used in the film? Were the meanings of the words the same as in English? Pinku furiri, I keep coming back to that. It was a bit of a favourite part of the film for me. I'll be interested to see. I will be interested to see what the students make of that. How did Okko's grandmother's way of communication differ from hers? Well, certainly Okko's grandmother's way of communication was on several higher levels of formality than the way Okko was communicating, particularly in the initial part of the film. The film also used a ghost, and I thought this was great too. When the grandmother was saying nothing, the director of the film obviously wanted the viewers to know exactly what was going on, and the ghost was the ghost's explanation of the situation to Okko allowed for a narrative type aspect to revealing the emotion and desire of the grandmother. Which it was very, very interesting. How else in the film was emotion portrayed? Certainly when Matsuki and Okko had their first showdown at school, the rest of the class were quite shocked when she stood up to when Okko stood up to Matsuki, and that was portrayed in the way that the faces were shown. Certainly, it was a different style of animation to get the emotion across. Okay, now during the film, students can have of course listen to the dialogue within the film, and can contrast how people speak to each other. Certainly, this includes language used by the staff at the inn, the formal language used by the grandmother, language used by the ghosts, and of course, language used by Okko. Right at the beginning of the film, certainly Okko was a lot louder and showed a lot less hesitation in what she said. Whereas as she developed as a character throughout the film, she certainly had more control over her language. And you can really look at this in how the context influenced the medium of the message. Certainly, she wasn't so polite when she was speaking to Matsuki, except at the time that she went and asked favors from her. Okay. Now, moving on to the subtitling, just having a look at the subtitling in the film, certainly an opportunity to explore translating. Prior to the film, encourage the students to observe closely the subtitling when they watch the film, and using their knowledge of Japanese, see if any interesting translations or things come up that were missed. As we know, translation often is functional and not literal, and students may see certain words that are then not reflected in the subtitles below. Following the film, reflect on what students noticed about the subtitling. Of course, have a bit of a chat about it. Would do students think it would be an interesting job? Certainly difficult. Were there things not translated directly? Discuss possible reasons for this. Students could film themselves speaking with friends about what they're going to do after school or what they do on the weekend, and see if they can add some subtitles to that. Okay. Now, one way into this is what were the differences in register present in the Japanese used in the film? Sorry, were the differences in register present in the Japanese used in the film properly reflected in the translation? Sometimes they might have been, sometimes certainly not. Okay, now prior to attending the film, there are a number of themes from the film that students could work into a survey. Students could survey each other in Japanese to identify what they do in their spare time. Now, that really comes from the view of going to an onsen as spare time and leisure time. Japanese people will go to the onsen to relax, coalesce, do nothing, and just rejuvenate. Certainly, you could often see Japanese families in an onsen village where they go to spend their leisure time, and it would be interesting if the students surveyed each other, what do they do with their families on the weekend? It'd be an interesting cultural contrast, I think. Also, asking the students what Japanese films have they seen, what would they like to see. This information could be used to create a list of the class's top 10 Japanese movies, certainly to create wider cultural interest. Following the film, teachers can look at focusing on any of the episodic stories within the film to build ideas for classroom activities, either in English or Japanese, depending on their level, of course. Now, writing a review of the inn, there was a review of the inn, or at least an article of the inn written within the one of the stories in the film. Higher level students could certainly be challenged to write what there was. Possibly, I think that would certainly be in their within their capabilities. You could also use the film's focus on food as a stimulus to write a menu for the inn. Now, there was quite a focus on food, and really you could be looking at the Japanese saying that you eat with your eyes, and that is really paying attention to presentation and the detail, and some of the detail that people put into food and their cooking in Japan is reflected in the film, and that could you can draw in the point of Tokyo being the one city in the world that has the highest number of Michelin stars, possibly because of the attention to detail that Japanese chefs put into their put into their meals, and that's certainly reflected in the film. Other things teachers could look at doing with their class is to write a set of rules relating to the manners and behaviours about what an innkeeper or hotel staff shouldn't do. That's straight out of Year 10 or the Year 11 curricula, where we look at what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do and what you have to do. Certainly that could be good practice for some students. And when you look at it in terms of hotel staff, you could almost see it as having some kind of influence or application that could be used in a vet course. Now, when Okko first goes to school, she has to give her self-introduction, which is always a big part of Japanese culture. She gets up and says who she is, says where she's from, says what she likes. I think certainly students could prepare and deliver a self-introduction similar to the one that Okko did on her first day at school. And another possible suggestion, the fortune-telling character who became Okko's friend, using that as a stimulus, you could create a set of fortune-telling cards to predict what others will do on the weekend or in the holidays. Students could create those cards and then role play or take turns being the fortune teller. Okay. Now, after attending the film, other suggestions that you could possibly look at doing in your classroom, locate and listen to the song featured when Okko goes shopping. It's a high tempo part of the film that follows on from a bit of a grim experience when Okko has the flashback in the car. But you see the girls, and with the music playing, they're changing into wearing a whole lot of different styles of clothing, and you could use that as a prelude to a fashion parade, one run by students, to add tempo and excitement. And that would link into describing what people are wearing, colours, clothing, etc. Also, within that, explore the artist of the song as a way into investigating J-pop further. I think the artist might be Perfume, but further investigation could be necessary there. Now, many of the themes and ideas related to culture and language mentioned in the notice section of the presentation can be used for student work. Traditional aspects of Japanese houses, you could use that for describing locations. Students could set up could assume the persona of one of the characters and set up a filmed interview. Building on the theme of Hana no Yu as a tourist town, students could create a kanji map of the town using gakko, mise, jinja, yama, ie, hoteru, kawa, just as kanji practice, but also they may enjoy making a map of the town. The other thing they could do, and they might enjoy this, create an advertisement for the inn from the film, include details of where it is, what the inn offers, and what you could do there. If you put that text type if you look at that text type in terms of technology, Possibly you could write a blog as well. Different people talking about their experiences from staying at the inn and what they did. Now, following the film, ask students to reflect on the experience of watching the film, how they engaged with the Japanese language in the film. Did they rely entirely on the subtitles? Chances are they probably did, but there certainly would have been words that popped out to them. Did they feel their understanding of Japanese language and culture enriched their experience of the film? How did the film broaden their understanding of Japanese language and culture? Certainly, they will walk away from this film with a greater understanding of what an onsen is and Japanese people's relationship to the natural world in terms of living in a volcanic country and a whole culture of bathing growing up around hot springs. Asking the students how did this compare to other Japanese films they've seen? As this film was directed by someone with previous connections to Studio Ghibli, how does it compare to films like Ponyo and Spirited Away, which I mentioned before? Use the comparisons between these films to make sentences expressing similarities between the films. Possibly that's certainly a VCE activity, but good grammar practice. And in the same way, practice use of comparative language by writing a series of observations and impressions of the film. You could compare the two girls. You could possibly compare the ghosts. Compare what you've done with your friends. This could include comparisons of the different types of animation used in the film or comparisons of the film itself with other Japanese films. Okay. Now, I'll just pass over to Kerry.
Thank you, Sean. That was fantastic. Before I ask if you have questions, Jess or Philip, I just want to thank both Josh and Sean for sharing their interesting and thought-provoking insights and suggestions into this film and how to work with students to make the experience of seeing the film a valuable, enjoyable and educational one. Certainly had some great ideas linking to the Victorian curriculum, Sean. I really enjoyed that. Jess has a question. Do you know? No, Jess, the thing about the MIFF Schools program is they're not available outside of this program. So it's not going to be available on DVD or Netflix. It's the only opportunity to see it is part of this program. I can see Jess is still typing. Philip, if you have any questions, feel free to type it. We've only got 2 of you here, so you could turn on your microphone and ask a question to Josh or Sean if you'd like to. No? Okay, there's one. Philip, will the JLTAV publish a study guide? There's no plans for that, Philip. The only thing, JLTAV aren't involved in this particular collaboration. The schools program for MIFF have 8 different films, and MLTAV work with MIFF to develop a webinar for each of the films. But outside of the webinar, that's all that we offer. It is an interesting question, and I certainly do share the fact that the webinars exist and the films and advertise them through the SLAs. So that could be something that we raise with Nathan Lane with JLTAV, but certainly not at this stage. It's not planned. Okay, if there's no other questions, Jess, Philip, I'll just quickly explain the certificate of participation process. We do actually record this webinar, and it does get put probably tonight up on the MIFF Schools website. But to get a certificate of participation for the 1 hour PL time or for the engagement with the webinar, if you go to this link, I'll also send you, you can actually copy it from here, or I'll put it on the MLTAV website. So if you go there a bit later tonight or tomorrow under www.mltav.asn.au, you'll actually see it there. and you can follow that link. Just fill out a few questions, and then I'll have your email address to email the certificate of participation to you. So if there's no other questions, thank you, Josh. Thank you, Sean. That was fantastic.
Thank you, Kerry, and thanks everybody for joining in.
So we'll sign off. So thank you, Josh. Thanks for joining us, Jess and Philip. Feel free to contact me at the MLTAV office if you think of any other questions. Okay, thank you. Good night.